I welcome everybody to the Smith School webinar on how things are going here in Dubai at COP28. I'm just going to allow a little minute extra for people to join. I can see people coming in as we speak. But it's incredibly useful, I think, for everybody to have an opportunity to take stock of what's happened, where we're going, and some of the big things that have emerged, and many of the things that need to happen here to serve the climate agenda. So I can still see the odd person joining, but I think welcome to everybody. We'll make a formal start now because I know time is tight, and we've all got a lot going on here in Dubai. So as I say, welcome. It's the halfway stage. My name is David Shruckman. I'm the moderator for this event, and it's a great pleasure to take part. This is my 12th COP. I think for anybody, it is by miles the biggest, 100,000 people here. It's confusing. I mean, I've never known a COP where I bumped into so many people in corridors and in the various sort of hot walkways between buildings where people have either asked me what on earth is going on or I've asked them. So it's terrific to have this opportunity to try to clear the air and understand what actually is happening and what's been achieved. So before we get to the panel, let me just throw out a couple of thoughts from my sort of journalistic perspective of what the headlines are. I mean, number one, day one, getting a COP formal decision on the loss and damage fund, I think is a huge achievement and did send a jolt of energy through the whole place, which was very, very welcome, particularly for small island states and the most vulnerable nations who've been campaigning for this for years. So that really is a step forward. The first ever health day at a COP. Nothing hugely tangible out of it, but I think the fact that it's now on the COP agenda is hugely welcome, given the vital importance of health impacts of climate change and in so many ways, and including the angle of the healthcare sector being a big emitter, 6% globally. So very interesting to see the big healthcare companies engaged in this debate now, looking how to decarbonize. It seems to be an agreement on getting food systems, big emitter, included in the so-called NDCs, the carbon reduction plans. We'll see how that translates in practice. And another headline, tripling renewables. Most countries here have signed up to that, although how that turns into practice remains to be seen. But again, good to have that as a sort of headline agreement so early on. And then, of course, not so much an elephant in the room as a great woolly mammoth or something, fossil fuels, which here we are in a petro state with the COP president being the head of a very, very big oil company and all kinds of questions and allegations swirling around about him, which has kind of spawned a whole lot of sub-debates, really, about what did Sultan Al Jaber mean when he said there was no science to justify phasing out fossil fuels, which he then rode back on, including some of Oxford's most distinguished people in the newspapers, kind of debating kind of what this means and different perspectives of the way forward. In my perhaps rather blunt way, it seems to me that there's one perspective is, a safe future must involve some form of carbon capture. As opposed to carbon capture is never going to work at scale, and sort of dwelling on it or relying on it for too long, for too much, just gives the big fossil fuel industries more excuse to keep doing their thing. So we're going to tackle that head on because I think it's so fundamental, and then we'll get on to some of the many, many other interesting and important issues that that are arising here. So let me quickly introduce the panel and then come back to the fossil fuel thing. So Alexis McGivern, delighted to have you here, Ingie Johnston and Steve Smith. Steve, do you want to pick up first, you're director of Oxford Net Zero, just sort of lay out where we are with this fossil fuel debate? What does the science say? And perhaps clear the air on this exchange of views that's now in the public, and there's nothing wrong about that. But I think people who perhaps read The Guardian this morning might want to know where things stand. So Steve, over to you first, and then we'll come to our other panelists.
Thank you, David. As you say, a lot of discussion about do we need to aim for fossil fuel phase down, phase out? What's the role of carbon capture and storage, carbon removal in all this? In a nutshell, the basic science of what carbon dioxide does to the climate is very clear. It's Miles Allen, a professor here at Oxford, who was kind of formative in making the discovery, really, that every unit of fossil CO2 we put into the atmosphere raises global average temperature and keeps it raised actually for centuries or more. So if we want to limit the global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, as we've agreed globally, or even to 2 or 3 or 4 degrees, we need to get to a point where we're not adding any more CO2 into the atmosphere. That's the concept, essentially, of net zero emissions. And actually, net zero rather than zero comes about because the idea is if we have some residual emissions into the atmosphere, we're going to need to balance them out in some way to net zero in order to stabilize the climate. Now, on the question of sort of phase out, phase down, if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change most recent report, which is, of course, the best available science for the international negotiating process, they have several dozen pathways that look at how we might stabilize with an evens chance around 1.5 degrees. And they all show very, very rapid declines in fossil fuel use. This is not fossil fuel emissions, but outright use of fossil fuels completely. They show, for instance, that the primary energy we get from oil and gas both decline by 10% in this decade by 2030. And they show coal use declining really precipitously, sort of by 3/4, 75% this decade, and 95% on average in 2050. That's essentially, you know, if coal is to exist at all, it'll be very negligible. And any of it that is used actually capture and storage. That's the idea that we capture those emissions at point of combustion and we bury them away permanently. But the other thing, so that's not down to a 100% across the board, but they're very, very steep declines. And the International Energy Agency actually agrees with that. The other thing that is really important in these scenarios is the scaling up of carbon capture and storage. That's actually a crucial technology as well for meeting our climate targets. And we should be working hard to scale it. But I think we need to be aware of the relative scales we're talking about. So current CO2 emissions from global activities are 40 billion tons per year. They've never been higher. And sadly, we've not been able to pull that down yet, despite, you know, a generation of negotiations. Currently, carbon capture and storage exists as a technology. It's capturing about 45 million tons of CO2 per year. So it's 3 orders of magnitude smaller. So in these IPCC pathways I talked about with the very rapid declines in fossil fuel use, carbon capture and storage scales up to maybe be like 100 times as big as it is. That's a massive scale up, but that's still dealing with 10% or, you know, in an uncertainty range, 5 to 20% of fossil fuels. 90% of the problem will be solved by not using fossil fuels.
Great, Steve. Many thanks for that. I think that's a really clear kind of exposition of what the science says, and conceivably in Q&A, and we're keen to get your questions. The topic will come up, and it's bound to come up again as we approach the end game here, because we're all keen to see what actual words are used. As Christiana Figueres said in her podcast, which I heard this morning, is the word out, as in phase out, going to be in? I think that's going to be something we'll all look at. Steve, I'll come back to you in a minute to drill into more detail into what you've been focused on so far and what your headlines are. I wonder whether, Alexis, we could turn to you first to what you've been doing, what sort of caught your attention, what you think COP might have achieved at this halfway stage.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for having me. And it's really good to start the conversation with the big fossil fuel phase out elephant in the room. So it's good to have that on the table. So my name is Alexis McGivern. I work at Oxford Net Zero, which is a research group. We're all part of the Smith School, but I sit in the Oxford Net Zero research group as well. And we have had a few priorities here at this COP, mainly focus on the non-negotiated outcomes at COP28. So for those who are maybe not so familiar with the COP process, it is a bit of a beast. There are 5 different types of meetings happening at the same time. The implementation of the convention, the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol, of the Paris Agreement, And then there are subsidiary bodies that work on technical advice and implementation. So there are lots of different people running around with different hats on. But within that, there are sort of three different types of activity and work. So the negotiations, which we've been talking about a lot, which is state-to-state negotiations. We have everything that happens in the non-state actor space. So exhibits, side events, which involves sort of a typical conference knowledge exchange, and they're mostly about building partnerships between actors. And then there's all the political commitments. So you mentioned at the top, David, the Double Down, Triple Up, which is a political commitment. And so there are bilateral or regional agreements that come out of the COP as well. So COPs are not just about negotiations. They are negotiations are a huge part, but they are about kind of wider climate action. As you mentioned, 100,000 people here all working on climate. So some of the things that we've been following are really in that second bucket of the non-state actor piece. So we've been working with the Race to Zero on working on principles for service providers. So currently service providers fall in a bit of a gray space when it comes to measuring and accounting for emissions. So this includes consultancy firms, advertisers, law firms, that can enable emissions through the advice that they provide, but those emissions aren't necessarily well captured under current greenhouse gas accounting principles. So we've been working with the Race to Zero, which is the big non-state actor campaign to ratchet up ambition on the non-state actor side, to try to provide some guidance on how we should think about service providers. So I was co-chairing that group for the last 6 months, and we launched our guidance day before yesterday on that. And the other piece that we've been following, or that I've been following specifically, is on youth involvement and youth capacity building to engage in the UNFCCC. So we've been running a training program as well for the last 6 months to upskill 4,500 young climate activists on the negotiation tracks of the UNFCCC, so that when they come to COP, they're able to kind of pitch their advocacy asks in the language of the UNFCCC. So we've also been following youth capacity building pieces as well as the wider net zero regulation and policy agreements that are coming out of this COP.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And funnily enough, I was doing a training program for youth ambassadors to help them not use COP speak, but plain English, so they could reach wider audiences. And in parallel, you were doing the opposite, which I think is actually a really valuable process. Inji, yeah, you've been focusing on the global stocktake. We know the sort of headlines of that, and finance. So do you want to tell us kind of how things are going from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David, and thanks for having me here. I think just before diving into some of the things on the table at the negotiations, I think on the fossil fuel element, it's actually just worth noting as well that it's actually very new in the UNFCCC context to be even talking about fossil fuels at the table. It wasn't even until COP26, that real conversations happened and were crystallized into what's called the cover decision. And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting and a good news story, actually, that, now that it's been raised at this level, there's a lot of pressure to get an outcome in this regard. And at the same time, I think what's really interesting and also worth noting is that, as Alexis provided some context about what happens at COP28, it's also important to note who's on the ground here, and in particular that this year, there's 4 times more fossil fuel lobbyists than even last year. So there's 2,456 at the bit last count. And so it's makes for a really interesting space with a lot of competing tensions there. And kind of linked to those competing tensions, I'm following the climate finance kind of discussions at a high level, and then specifically the carbon market developments under Article 6. But also this COP28 is the first global stocktake. So this happens every 5 years. And as the name suggests, it's designed to both take stock of what's happened today, but also, importantly, plug gaps for the future. So as you can imagine, this has been a really contested area of negotiations, because it's something that brings up all the different elements from across different streams that are both negotiated at COP and others that aren't. But really cutting across all of them is the kind of fault lines of finance. And so there's a number of key issues that kind of, run through a lot of the topics here. For example, who's going to pay for the transitions and for mitigation, adaptation efforts that are needed. And so that's often kind of discussion between, Annex and non-Annex 1 countries, or for, in normal speak, which is developed and developing countries. But it's also interesting because increasingly we're also seeing discussions about who should pay, even between the public sector and the private sector, which I'll come back to, and as well about what metrics matter, how we define climate finance, to track what's happening, and ultimately make sure it's getting delivered. And all these kind of elements are both looking to be negotiated as part of the Global Stocktake, but ultimately also inform some of the key elements of the Paris Agreement, which are being operationalized here, including Article 6, which I can speak to in a bit more detail later if interested. But yeah, it's a really interesting kind of medley of different issues on the table here, but it's really yeah, interesting, I think, to just highlight that there is these competing views. But there's also, because of the first Global Stocktake opportunity here, a lot of potential to put some interesting things on the table that haven't had space in past COPs.
And just on that global stock take, I mean, we know the sort of headlines, don't we? That basically no one's doing enough. I mean, isn't that so in layman's speak? So in the debates that you're in, discussions that you're part of, is it more about what do we do about that? I mean, is it that you can use the results of the stock take to drive further? I'm going to say action. I hate the word action. I try to avoid it, but anyway, yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's definitely the intention, but I think, you know, and unfortunately, so we're still seeing a lot of the kind of same political debates kind of impact global stocktake. And, you know, we're even seeing this on a very tangible level. For example, as I mentioned, climate finance has been one of the key tensions, and many saw the global stocktake as being this opportunity to provide more information on what Article 21C actually means. And so Article 21C is one of the 3 long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, and that's the one that speaks to basically how we change our financial system to align with both the mitigation and adaptation elements of the Paris Agreement. And yeah, there's been a lot of pushback about how that's defined, because again, parties on both sides are kind of really worried about, you know, ultimately what the implications for action could be from that. But it's really interesting because increasingly we're also seeing just very tangible response measures being brought up. For example, the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU is being brought up, you know, in a range of different negotiation streams as an example, you know, of progress in some respects, but a lot of parties are trying to get text to kind of counter that explicitly. So I think it's yeah, it's always interesting because there's debate about how, you know, much the words matter here in these texts, but I think it's clear that, you know, countries at least see some very different implications on the table depending on what options, you know, progress through the negotiations.
Great. Thanks for that. Okay, so Steve. Oh, sorry, Alexis. Do you want to just jump in?
Just to add a little bit of extra context there from Inge's great overview of the GST, is that the GST should be more than just a kind of homework checking exercise. This is the great you know, impact of the global stocktake. It's not just. It is an assessment of where we are and an honest reality check, as some have called it, but it also is directly going to inform the next round of NDCs, which are nationally determined contributions. And so if we take a big temperature,
which I translate as carbon reduction plans, because
exactly, yeah. If we take a big goal like one that's in the Paris Agreement of limiting warming to no more than 2 degrees and aiming for 1.5 degrees, that is a massive global goal, but each country needs to submit what they call their NDC towards that. So I'm Canadian, for example, and so every few years they update what their contributions will be towards that goal. And the idea of the global stocktake is to do that from a place of full clarity on where we are and where the gaps are. So what, you know, civil society and others are calling for is for the GST to really inform high level political ambition. For example, things like sectoral targets that should be defined and deliver in a policy pathway towards that. So need to make sure that it moves just beyond an information gathering exercise and into the next phase. And this is the conclusion of a process that began at COP26.
Great. Thanks. Okay. Thanks for that. Okay. Look, over to you, Steve, for your thoughts halfway through, and then we'll pick up on a few issues that follow.
Gosh, well, you're right. The thing is enormous, both in terms of process and numbers. I've been spending a lot of my time less directly on the negotiations, but there's a whole extra world of the different national pavilions that hold a lot of talks in the wings, relevant either to things being negotiated now or things that actually countries and others want to put on the table that might come up in future negotiations. And And so I've been focused on two things, actually. One is we've got a brilliant initiative at Oxford called the Net Zero Tracker, which is actually a kind of broadly student-led initiative. We have a lot of volunteer students, and we've expanded it beyond Oxford now, but they go out and look at which entities around the world, countries, companies, regions, and cities have actually pledged to reach net zero emissions, and how robust are those targets. So we've done a piece of analysis which we launched here at COP, really with fossil fuels in the crosshairs, given that we knew this was going to be a big issue. And while we have, in many ways, a good news story that there's been a plethora of net zero pledges since COP26 in Glasgow, actually. We've got over 151 countries which have made some form of net zero pledge. Over half of the world's 2,000 largest publicly listed companies now have some form of net zero pledge. We've looked at, within those net zero pledges, what do they actually say about fossil fuels? Because given fossil fuels is pretty much, you know, the elephant in the room, you would expect that those who are being ambitious in getting to net zero might have something to say about that in their plans. And we find some pretty depressing, but perhaps not surprising statistics. We looked at which countries and companies are pledging to phase out use or production of fossil fuels, but also which ones are even pledging to phase out exploration. And that's really crucial, because the International Energy Agency, for instance, points out that we already have enough fossil fuels running, opened up, or in the pipeline to meet our needs in the 1.5 degree world. So we don't need any further exploration. We find 13% of coal-producing nations have actually committed to a phase out of coal production, and that's crucial because near complete phase out of coal is a really robust signal we get from the IPCC, as I mentioned. But when it comes to oil and gas, only 3% of countries with net zero targets have actually even pledged to commit phasing out exploration. And that 3% is a recurring theme. So 3% of countries have actually pledged to phase out oil and gas production. So these are really small fractions that are actually pledging to do anything really ambitious on fossil fuels, despite having a net zero pledge. So that kind of how serious are countries and big companies and cities on really ramping down strongly fossil fuels is something that we've been analysing and spreading the message around. There are some good examples, actually. So Spain, as a country, has embedded a national phase-out set of targets into its legislation. The company Ørsted and others, you know, they're successfully diversifying their business model away from dependence on fossil fuels. So there are a few examples of good practice out there, but not many. And the other thing that I've been then looking at is carbon removal, which links to the whole CCS story. And actually, another reason why carbon capture and storage might be strategic or is strategic is because if we build an infrastructure to be able to transport and dispose of CO2, that becomes crucial, actually maybe less for fossil fuels. If the fossil fuel sector starts building this infrastructure, it might not be for them in the long run, but it might be for actually taking the stuff back out of the atmosphere. That's going to be really crucial for getting to net zero, meeting our climate goals, given that you know, even if we do really well on bringing down fossil fuel emissions for electricity generation, we might well still have residual emissions in agriculture, from flying, from certain parts of kind of industrial processes. So carbon removal and fossil fuels are the two things that I've been going around spending a lot of time in national pavilions talking about, and judging the quality of the coffee in various different national pavilions as well.
And some of them don't have any at all, as I found, or ice, which we all need in these hot conditions. So I think, Steve, you've thanks for that, and it sort of sets up a question that's come in from Simon in the audience about capturing CO2 directly from the air, which he says is totally misguided because the source is so dilute. I mean, I keep being asked about it. I don't know whether it's because of where we are or whether it's just getting more traction in the press or whatever, but I've sort of noticed a sudden uptick in discussion and interest in direct air capture, and I know you've looked at that. Do you want to just have a go at that?
Yes, there is a lot of interest in that at the moment. And it does exist as a technology. So there is the plant you may have heard of running up in Iceland called Orca, which has a capacity to directly capture 4,000 tons of CO2 per year from the air and actually store it in a very interesting way using the volcanic rock formations in Iceland. It turned it essentially into rock within a couple of years. That's 4,000 tons per year, the largest current direct air capture and storage plant. That's a million times smaller than the amount of emissions we have at the moment. And it's absolutely true that there are a lot of cheaper things that we can and should do as a priority to start cutting emissions, not use the stuff in the first place. Even if you're capturing CO2 and disposing of it, it's much easier to do from a point source rather than letting it going into the atmosphere and dilute down before you try and then capture it. But as I say, if we actually want to stabilize global average temperature at 1.5 degrees or any other level, we're going to need to get down to net zero CO2 emissions, and that's from all activities, not just from electricity generation, not just from road transport, not just even from aviation, but from the way we use land and from cement and steel and things. And there are going to be some tricky trade-offs at the margin, and I think that carbon removal solutions are going to therefore play an important part of the solution. And there's a lot of scope for the cost of these things to come down. I think they're likely to remain expensive. But one of the things that struck me at this COP actually is there's a lot of innovation going on, and it's not just different forms of direct air capture, but lots of innovative ways of using other processes to remove CO2 from the air, and quite a lot of excitement around that. I think we need to keep that into perspective. But these might be very, very useful tools once we've done the easy stuff that we know we can do this decade. And we know that technologies take a while to scale. So if we're talking about net zero by 2050 and we want these options at scale on that time frame, then we need to start sort of trialing them and learning by doing around about now.
And presumably creating the prospect of them coming down in price over that kind of time frame. And I know, Alexis, I think you wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, and just a couple of things to add to that, which is that the technologies on diluted carbon removal or not point source carbon removal are interesting too, because we tend to narrow the conversation about climate to carbon in the atmosphere. And as Steve mentioned, burning fossil fuels puts carbon into the atmosphere, and that is not good for a number of reasons. But also extraction of fossil fuels has many other externalities that are really important to consider, including health, human rights violations, land rights violations, biodiversity loss. And these are all things that cannot be handled by direct air capture. Just because you remove the carbon in the atmosphere doesn't mean you handle the very many negative externalities of fossil fuels. And I just wanted to touch as well on some of the campaigns or kind of civil society work on fossil fuel phase out, and some of the wins that they've made there. So the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been running for a number of years, which is a coalition of countries agreeing to end, as Steve just mentioned, exploration and exploitation of fossil fuels. They had their 10th member join Colombia on Monday, whenever that was, or I have no idea, whenever the second was. And that was a big endorsement, as well as the Director General of the WHO also giving an endorsement of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So these campaigns are really gaining momentum, and the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is it's a bit of a confusing landscape on the number of campaigns and treaties on fossil fuel phase out, but they had Kenya, Spain, and Samoa join as well. So there is a lot of momentum for country level commitments on phasing out fossil fuels. And separate to that, the Clean Energy Transition Partnership, which is 39 countries that agreed at COP26 to end the direct international public financing of for fossil fuel projects by the end of last year. Australia joined that today or yesterday. So both on the sort of financing of fossil fuels and on ending exploration and exploitation, there are a number of advancements made in that space. And just to come back to what Inji was talking about earlier with the 2,456 fossil fuel representatives here at COP this year, the response from civil society, and there's always creative, innovative ways that civil society are making their mark. There's stickers and lanyards and pins going around that say "I am not paid by the fossil fuel industry," so that people can mark on their UNFCCC badges that they are not funded by the fossil fuel industry. And the idea is that, you know, in future COPs that there would be such an uptake of this that you would have everyone but the fossil fuel lobbyists kind of identified. So it's slow, and it's very much come from the youth movement, who are pushing for this at Bonn as well. But yeah, that kind of transparency is super important, because they are, of course, in negotiating rooms and influencing party behaviors and decisions. So.
Yeah, and we had, didn't we? Is it 50 of the CEOs of some of the biggest oil firms here with their, including the head of ExxonMobil, with their declaration on net zero, but it was only net zero for production rather than the use of their fuels. Let's tackle a few more. It's great to have your questions, by the way. Please keep them coming. Max asking about the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. Do we all call that CBAM? Is that what we all call it now? I've heard different pronunciations of the acronym. And sort of perceptions of it, I guess. I mean, actually, I did see that China had sort of noted its opposition to this. Is that the right phrase? But something pretty strong anyway. They didn't like it. Perhaps Inji, you'd like to talk us through CBAM and how it's going to fly and how it's going down.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, as you said, David, China, and in coordination with the G77, has noted, you know, strong opposition to EU CBAM proposal for quite so many years, and but this is really the first time it's crystallized onto the agenda here at COP, and so it's come up in a number of streams, both in the actual agenda itself, but then also as part of the Global Stocktake, and then even under Article 6.8 specifically, which covers non-market mechanisms. And really, it I guess it covers two main things. You know, the first is whether these kind of market mechanisms and carbon pricing is an answer for one, but you know, I think it also comes back to the classic yeah, again, that finance fault line running through the negotiations of different stances between developed and developing countries, in particular because China and others want exclusions for, you know, within CBAM design, because it's not, you know, the EU's the first one, but other countries, you know, the US, Canada, others were kind of have been exploring these proposals in the background for a long time, but the EU is the first to kind of jump. But it was also really interesting because, you know, the process has been going on for several years, but the EU ultimately did decide not to include special provisions for LDCs and small island developing states, you know, formally into the CBAM, but that is something that they're going to be considering down the line, because also we're coming up against a huge other area of international law, the World Trade Law, and so, you know, it's really a carefully negotiated mechanism, but that also, when you've got the trade-off between trade law and international climate law, as we have here, it makes for a really interesting mix. But I will say, you know, even a few years ago at COP26, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the WTO director, has said that there's nothing she can see that's inconsistent with the EU CBAM and WTO law. So everyone's very much, well, the experts rather kind of are very clear that actually there is a way to design these kind of mechanisms and that they're necessary, especially given where we are at the state of play, but there's still this really strong pushback, and yeah, we're seeing that on across a number of fronts.
I mean, in simple terms, is it meant to be a kind of incentive to drive lower carbon production? But is it also used potentially as a protectionist measure to keep, for example, cheap Chinese EVs out of Europe?
You know, the true rationale behind behind it is always, again, at question, and again it comes back to WTO law, and even under the UN, like the Framework Convention on Climate Change, you know, from the 90s, originally did anticipate that, you know, that countries should be able to take these kinds of trade and economic measures, but not in a way that causes unjustifiable discrimination. And so that's where it comes, you know, that's where the letter of the law and how especially WTO trade law you know, applies against the context of climate change law and the wider body of international environmental law. So yeah, happy to have further conversations on this after, because it's a very complex area, but just to say that, you know, it is a fault line, but that, again, that we're seeing that fault line, you know, most developed countries recognize that carbon pricing and carbon border adjustment mechanisms have a really strong role to play, and that there's other, like China and the G77 have been strongly opposing this so far. And so, yeah, the ground's still to be laid as to where that ends up.
Great, thank you for that. I'm skipping around here a little bit in the questions, but Mostyn Brown asking, how formal might the target setting or reporting of future national fossil fuel supply inventory become, and should it be a distinct stream separate from the traditional focus on territorial emission reductions? Steve, do you want to have a go at that one?
It's not really my area of expertise.
Okay,
it's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would say that I do think areas of national inventories, they're one of the arcanities of this process as well, actually, and they don't get much public attention. It's essentially the boring but crucial accountancy work of how we measure countries' emissions. And I think that is one area, actually, which we will probably still see develop. So it might be very easy to think that that's all in stasis and well understood. But actually, as we increasingly talk about the need for carbon storage and carbon removal, we're actually talking about moving lumps of carbon, out from fossil coal, oil, and gas reserves into the atmosphere, and then maybe actually putting them back into other parts of the carbon cycle, into trees, into geological carbon stores, into rocks and minerals. And that means we're going to actually need to improve our inventories around the board in all parts of the carbon cycle, and not just say, well, we're not using that, therefore we don't need to worry about it. So I do, whether or not that means that countries move explicitly to the sorts of fossil fuel inventories that Mostyn is suggesting, I don't know. But I do think that actually in the coming decade or so, there are going to be moves to improve inventories to keep better track of where carbon is stored, as well as just whether or not we're using a fossil fuel.
I can also sort of predict, presumably, immense complexity in trying to work that out, and therefore delay, however valid an idea it is, and it would be, I think, incredibly useful. But I can just sort of see that, is there a risk of it taking a decade of COP time to come up with that?
Actually,
or would it be easier?
In many regards, the most complicated thing to do is keep track of where the carbon is in natural systems and woodlands and natural habitats and things like that. And actually, that a lot of that groundwork has been done, so it's not perfect, but it's operational. It shows that we can develop internationally agreed systems to track carbon in various stores. And actually, by comparison, if done well, putting CO2 into a geological storage site underground should be easy enough to track, but it's non-trivial and it needs doing well. We need to do really well at tracking whether carbon subsequently leaks out again. So it's important to get right. And actually the process for doing that comes through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have a task force on inventories, and they are the ones who then set the rules by which countries accept and use for their own inventories. So I expect that will improve over time, and it's a non-trivial undertaking, but it should be something that countries should get together and agree common ground rules on.
Great, thanks for that. Let's see what else we've. So Article 6. I used to dread when I was reporting for the BBC from COPs. I used to dread questions on air about Article 6 because it's complicated. Inji, I think that's your bag, isn't it? Am I right?
Yeah,
I'd love to hear
absolutely.
more about the importance of it and main developments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can link it.
Maybe I've frozen. Have I frozen?
Oh no, have I frozen?
I think it might be me. I don't know. Sorry, everybody froze.
Oh, no.
It probably means it's me. Inji, I was just going to throw the Article 6 question to you.
Oh, wonderful. Great. And I was just saying that I think I can answer the other question in tandem that I see on offsetting. And so really, yeah, they're great questions. And, it's not that clear, but I think the main place to start is that, market mechanisms to offset or to address carbon aren't new. They were anticipated under the Kyoto Protocol, so well over a quarter of a century old now. But there was a lot of flaws with the previous market mechanisms that were operationalized under the Kyoto Protocol. So you might have heard of like the clean development mechanism, for example. And, that's where ultimately there was a lot of allegations of trading hot air, rather than real emissions reductions. And, this is important in any kind of offsetting commitment, whether it's voluntary or otherwise, but it's most important when you're tying it back to a national contribution or national determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. And so Article 6 came in to try and create these market mechanisms and address that gap, but also to learn those lessons from the Kyoto Protocol. And, and acknowledging the question as well, this question around double counting. So it really took, its mantle was to really try and address some of these thorny issues that come up when trying to implement these offsetting schemes, whereby a project in one country is being used to offset emissions in another. Now, Article 6 seeks to do that in a few ways. There's Article 6.2, which governs these kind of bilateral cooperation agreements between countries, which essentially covers all manner of things. And they're actually negotiating right now whether we need to define what the parameters of what this cooperation could be. Then Article 6.4 is a much more open but centralized mechanism, and that's kind of the follow-up from the clean development mechanism, in that it's going to be the sustainable development mechanism. And under here again at this COP as well, we're seeing negotiation about what actually should be included within that, and really importantly, this difference between emissions reductions and removals and how those are treated, but ultimately what that means for the end projects on the ground. And again, offsetting is always one of those things that can make theoretical sense, because as we know, CO2 is fungible in the atmosphere. It doesn't matter where it's emitted, it has the same effect. But ultimately, when you're trying to look at offsetting it, it does not have the same effect. And that's because, as acknowledged in the question, there can be flaws with methodologies, flaws with implementation. When you're looking at some carbon removal, there can be reversals. When you're trying to run emission reduction projects, there can be emissions leakage, where you're just displacing where those emissions are coming from. So Article 6 is a package of rules, and it's really technical in the level of detail that they're trying to get to specify rules around that. And it's really interesting because, again, there's a lot of fault lines here about what that system could look like, how transparent it should be, where these kind of credits should be held and transferred between international registries and domestic ones. But there have been some important steps forward, and this came out of Glasgow, where the main kind of framework was agreed, that there is acknowledgement that there has to be corresponding adjustments between the national inventories to reflect the fact that if you purchase one in one country and the project's happening elsewhere, that actually that emissions unit is adequately transferred and accounted for, so that we don't end up double counting. And yet there's still a
sorry, Ingie, I'm gonna jump in, but just very briefly, is it your sense that some of this stuff will get nailed here?
It's still, so Article 6.2 is a lot more developed than Article 6.4. There's still a really live risk right now that Article 6.4 won't be agreed. I've heard last night parties said to agree maybe at COP 30 rather, some of the key formatting issues. And everything's to play for right now.
Okay, that's good. Hey, thanks. Great question from Laura Spence, who's praised us. Such a valuable conversation. Thank you, Laura, for that. Are you getting a sense of progress, she asks, on understanding and addressing the gendered cost of climate change? Funny enough, I was on a panel about this a couple of days ago, and it's always struck me in my reporting on it how for way too long the unequal burden of climate impacts falling on women and girls just hasn't had the traction it deserves. And also something I hadn't appreciated is in terms of access to finance for what might be absolutely brilliant zero carbon businesses. Women get an obscenely small percentage of that available finance. It's 2%, I think, globally, and half of 1% in Africa. So there's sort of two sides of the same coin. I don't know who wants to jump in. Alexis, do you want to come in on that one? And is it your sense that actually this is moving up the agenda and about time too?
Yeah, definitely. There's been some really good analysis of just what you've just touched on, David, about the lack of opportunities and also the increased vulnerabilities for women, intersex people, and also queer people, which some great analysis done by IIED last year, that when it comes to adaptation finance and adaptation opportunities, that queer people are also significantly left off when it comes to distributing finance. So I think that will be less of a discussion at this year's COP, but certainly is a big point of inequality and injustice. But I think I would point to the She Changes Climate campaign, who have done a really good job since COP26 to talk about gender representation in the leadership teams of the delegations, which has similarly to this year been women have been woefully underrepresented in terms of head of party delegations, and they are working on commitments, trying to get commitments from different leaders on inclusion policies for next year's COP, and this is a campaign that they've been working on for several years. We've also seen leadership from climate justice leaders like Mary Robinson, who are now running the Dandelion Project, which is a very gendered lens on climate justice. About 100 very prominent female climate justice leaders talking specifically about the impact on women and girls, and having leadership from women on climate for specific demands, including phasing out fossil fuels. So we are seeing more of it on the agenda. Whether or not that has translated to better representation is not necessarily the case, but it certainly is on the minds of many people and of negotiating parties here.
That's great to hear. Look, we're into the last few minutes here, so let's pack in what we can. Johan is asking, what do you think about nature-based carbon removal solutions? For example, reforestation. Steve, I always think that, perhaps in the minds of perhaps the most recalcitrant, laggardly corporates, that they can plant a few trees in 2049 and still meet a sort of net zero target.
I think David may have dropped out just for a second then, but I'll take that question. So yes, nature-based solutions is a kind of broad term for not just planting trees with the deliberate aim for sort of multiple co-benefits for livelihoods and production of products and biodiversity and things, but also, agricultural practices, working with soils, peatland restorations and things. And definitely they have a role to play. If you look at the kind of scenarios for 1.5 degrees, as well as squeezing down fossil fuel emissions, as well as reducing emissions from industry and reducing emissions from agriculture, you see very substantial tree planting, something on the order of 1.5 to 2 times the amount of carbon drawn down actually through restoring nature than is currently done. And it currently happens. But the important thing to remember, of course, is that we are still net deforesting globally. So about 2 billion tons of CO2 is removed per year through the fact that we're planting more trees. A lot of that happens in China. A lot of it happens in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, where former agricultural land is returning to trees. But I think the twin aim of ending deforestation and also enhancing nature is very important. Now, that is not a one-to-one kind of offset or balancing out of fossil CO2.
My line has packed up. I don't know if anyone can hear me.
We can hear you again now, David. Yes, don't worry. Can you hear me?
Frozen, and I think it's my end, so apologies for that. Oh, apparently you can hear me. Look, we're right on time. Steve, I lost the last part of what you were saying, but I think we're out of time. It just leaves me just to thank everybody for their questions, to thank our panel, Alexis, Ingi, and to you, Steve. And good luck with the final week. And let's see what comes out of it. Let's hope there's better Wi-Fi somewhere. Many thanks to everybody. Farewell and good luck.
David. Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.